Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep into, well, Don Quixote.
Don Quixote.
Yeah, you sent in some excerpts from the book, which is great, but also some,
Scholarly article.
yeah, scholarly articles.
Perfect.
Because this book, I mean, Don Quixote, it's like considered the first modern novel.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is. And you know what's wild?
What?
It was a huge hit back in the day, like right when it came out.
So like a bestseller.
A total bestseller.
Wow. Okay, so...
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
For a book so, groundbreaking and a character everyone knows, Cervantes himself is, well, a bit of a mystery.
Okay, so we have this literary giant, but
Yeah.
the guy who wrote it is basically a ghost.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
We know surprisingly little about the man behind Don Quixote.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can you believe it took 4 generations after the book was published for someone to even try writing his biography?
Really? 4 generations?
4 generations.
That's crazy. But, okay, so we don't know a lot about Cervantes the man, but we must know something, right? Like, what kind of life did he lead? What else can we dig up about him?
Oh, we can dig up some stuff for
Yeah.
sure. It wasn't all, quill and parchment for Cervantes. The guy was a soldier, fought in the Battle of Lepanto.
Hold on. Lepanto, wasn't that one of the biggest naval battles ever? I vaguely remember, like, something about it being a big turning point.
Exactly. You're totally right. A major turning point. And Cervantes was right there in the middle of it. Eve got wounded.
Wounded? Like, how badly?
Got shot 3 times.
3 times? That's insane. And he kept fighting.
Kept right on fighting. Apparently, he said he'd rather die serving his king and God than, be safe and sound.
Yeah.
Talk about dedication.
Wow. Okay, so we've got a war hero who's also a literary genius. But wait, there's more, right? Wasn't there something about pirates, too?
Oh, yeah. Can't forget the pirates.
Yeah.
So after the war, Cervantes gets captured by pirates, right? Spends 5 years as a captive in Algiers.
5 years. As a prisoner.
Yep. And get this, he tried to escape multiple times.
Wow. He just, like, couldn't sit still, could he? Always had to be, like, in the action.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Which makes you wonder, right?
What?
This adventurous spirit, this guy who just couldn't stay put, do we see that in his writing? Do we see, I don't know, Cervantes in Don Quixote?
That's a great question. And it makes me think about something else, too. I mean, it sounds like Cervantes wasn't exactly setting out to write, like, a masterpiece with Don Quixote.
You're right. It's wild, really. Because, see, Don Quixote wasn't even the book he wanted to write. Cervantes, he dreamt of writing plays.
Plays? Really?
Plays.
Wow. Now I'm trying to imagine, like, Don Quixote on a stage,
Right.
tilting at windmills under a spotlight.
That's a funny image. And, it makes you wonder if Cervantes himself ever imagined, like, how huge Don Quixote would become. Because from what we can tell, he kind of brushed it off, treated it like just a fun little book. He even called it a libro de entretenimiento.
A libro de what?
Libro de entretenimiento. Basically, just a book for entertainment.
So he writes the first modern novel, this book that changes everything. And he's like, whatever, just a bit of fun.
It seems that way.
That's incredible.
And he didn't even bother revising it properly.
Seriously.
Seriously. It blows my mind to think that this masterpiece, this book we're talking about, was almost an afterthought for the guy who wrote it.
An afterthought, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I gotta say, it's a pretty hilarious afterthought. The way Cervantes writes, it's so funny, but it's not like, knock-knock jokes or anything. It's different.
You're picking up on something really important there, something that scholars point out too. Cervantes, he was a master of what they call unsmiling gravity.
Unsmiling gravity. What's that?
Okay, so his humor, it doesn't wink at you. He doesn't point at the joke and say, get it. He just lays out these totally absurd situations, and he does it with a completely straight face, like he's reporting the news. And the ridiculousness, it just, speaks for itself.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So it's like he sets up these crazy situations, and it's up to us to react.
Exactly. It's like he trusts us, the readers, to get the joke without him having to spell it out. And a perfect example of this, a perfect example of unsmiling gravity, is Sancho Panza.
Sancho Panza, Don Quixote's sidekick.
Sidekick, squire, yeah. So you got Don Quixote with his head in the clouds, all these lofty ideals, and then you've got Sancho Panza, who's, very down-to-earth, very practical,
Yeah.
and the way they clash, that's where the humor comes from. But Cervantes, he plays it straight, which honestly makes it even funnier.
I see. Like, Sancho Panza is the voice of reason in this world of knights and chivalry.
You got it.
Okay, I like it. But hold on. Before we get too deep into the humor, can we, rewind a bit? What's the deal with Don Quixote's adventures in the first place? Why is he even out there?
Oh, right. So the whole reason Don Quixote sets off on these crazy quests is because he's totally obsessed with those old books about knights and chivalry. The ones with, like, King Arthur and all that. He reads those books day and night, and he's convinced they're all true, like literally true. So naturally, he decides to follow in their footsteps. Becomes a knight-errant himself.
And that's where the windmills come in.
That's where the windmills come in.
Okay, before we get to the windmills, which I'm dying to hear about, by the way, I gotta say, this whole thing, this blurring of fantasy and reality,
Mm.
it's kind of, I don't know, relevant today, isn't it? Like, we're constantly bombarded with information, and who even knows what's real anymore?
You're so right. And it makes you think, doesn't it,
Yeah.
about why we cling to these big stories, even when they don't quite, match up with reality.
It's like we want to believe, right?
We do. And that's what makes Don Quixote so fascinating. He shows us, maybe in a funny way, how powerful stories can be, how they can shape our whole world.
Okay, so Don Quixote isn't just a funny story about a crazy knight. It's about, like, how we create our own realities.
Exactly. And by looking at how Cervantes does this, how he mixes humor and this deeper meaning, we can learn a lot about ourselves, about how we see the world.
This is already blowing my mind, and we haven't even gotten to the windmills yet.
Don't worry, we'll get there. But first, I think it's important to understand what makes that windmill scene so, well, hilarious. To understand the humor, we need to picture it. Okay, so Don Quixote, he's riding across this vast plain, and he sees these massive structures in the distance. And in his mind, they're not windmills. They're giants.
Giants.
Giants. And Cervantes, of course, he describes it all totally straight-faced, like it's the most normal thing in the world. And that's what makes it so funny, the contrast between what Don Quixote sees and what's actually there.
I'm starting to get why this book has been so popular for, like, centuries. It's funny, but it also makes you think.
You got it. And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover in Don Quixote, so much more to laugh about and to think about.
I can't wait. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, learned about Cervantes, talked about his unique sense of humor. But now I want to get into the book itself, Don Quixote. Like, what else should we know about it to really appreciate it?
Well, one passage you sent in really struck me. It's the part where Don Quixote leaves the inn for the first time, thinking he's a real knight.
Oh, yeah, where he's so excited he practically bursts his horse girths.
Right.
That part always cracks me up. It's like he's so deep in his fantasy that even, like, walking out the door becomes an epic adventure.
Exactly. And that's what makes those early chapters so much fun to read. You see Don Quixote setting off on this grand quest, but with this totally warped perspective on everything.
It's like, when you're watching a movie and you just know something bad is about to happen, but you can't look away.
Oh, totally. Like a slow-motion train wreck.
Exactly. And what's even funnier is that Cervantes never, like, breaks character. He never turns to the reader and says, hey, isn't this ridiculous? He just describes these insane situations like they're totally normal.
It all goes back to that unsmiling gravity. That's what makes the humor so effective.
Right, right. Like in that scene where Don Quixote meets those travelers and makes them swear that his lady love, Dulcinea, is the most beautiful woman in the world.
Oh, man, that scene is classic. And it shows you just how deeply Don Quixote believes in his delusions, Like no amount of logic or common sense can shake him.
He's committed. But, it's not all just laughs. There's also this, like, almost a sadness to Cervantes's humor. Like, he sees how absurd humans can be, and he kind of laughs at it, but it's also kind of tragic.
That's a really sharp observation, and I think you're right. There is this bittersweet quality to a lot of the humor in Don Quixote. But even though he's obviously delusional, you can't help but kind of admire his sincerity. He really believes in what he's doing.
Absolutely. He might be totally bonkers, but you're kind of rooting for him anyway. And of course, you've got Sancho Panza there trying to bring him back down to earth. He's like the voice of reason and all this craziness.
That's exactly what he is.
Yeah.
He's what we call a foil to Don Quixote.
Yeah.
A character who's the opposite of the main guy, which makes Don Quixote's quirks stand out even more. Like, light and shadow. You need both to make the picture interesting.
I get it. So Sancho Panza is practical, grounded, and, let's be honest, a little greedy. But he sticks by Don Quixote no matter what.
He's loyal, even when he's exasperated, which, let's face it, is most of the time. But speaking of memorable scenes, I think we have to talk about the windmills.
Yes, the windmills. That's like the iconic Don Quixote image, right? The
Yeah.
lone knight charging at those giant windmills thinking they're monsters.
Exactly. It's the perfect example of Don Quixote's fantasy world crashing into reality.
And of course, it ends badly, right? With Don Quixote tumbling off his horse and blaming it all on, like, evil enchanters or something.
Well, obviously. Because in Don Quixote's world, there's always a magical explanation for everything, especially when things go wrong.
Right. Like when he finds that barber's basin and is convinced it's some magical helmet.
The helmet of Mambrino. Even when everyone's telling him it's just a basin, he refuses to budge. Classic Don Quixote.
It's like he's seeing the world through these, like, super rose-colored glasses. But hold on, those magical explanations, they're more than just Don Quixote being crazy, right? Like, there's something deeper going on there.
Let's put it this way. Don Quixote is a book about stories, about how powerful they can be, how they can shape how we see the world. Don Quixote's obsession with chivalry books isn't just a funny plot device. It's Cervantes saying something about how stories can actually influence our whole understanding of reality.
Whoa, okay. So Don Quixote isn't just a fun adventure story. It's like a commentary on how we make our own realities.
Exactly. And if you think about it, we do that all the time in our own lives, don't we? We're surrounded by stories from the news, social media, movies, even just conversations with friends. And just like Don Quixote, we have to be careful not to let those stories, completely take over our view of what's real.
It's tricky, right? Like, you want to have your ideals, but you also don't want to be completely out of touch with reality. It's a tough balance.
It is a tough balance. And that's exactly what makes Don Quixote so relevant, even after all these centuries. It's not just about a crazy knight. It's about all of us trying to figure out how to live in this complex world. But, Don Quixote isn't all deep thoughts and big ideas. It's also full of these, like, vivid, almost cinematic scenes.
Oh, yeah, like the one with the barber's basin.
Exactly. The infamous helmet of Mambrino. It's a perfect example of how Don Quixote sees what he wants to see, even when it's totally obvious that's not what it is.
And you gotta love Sancho Panza's reaction, right? He's always caught between, like, believing his master and just being completely baffled by the whole thing.
Poor Sancho. He's like the ultimate straight man in a comedy duo. But Sancho isn't just a sidekick. He's got his own ambitions too. Remember how he's always hoping Don Quixote will reward him with an island to govern?
Oh, right. He wants to be the big man in charge.
Exactly. That desire for, personal gain adds a whole other layer to their relationship. It's not just about loyalty. It's about, like, ambition and self-interest too, which makes their dynamic even more interesting, because who hasn't been there, hoping to get something out of a situation, even if it's a little bit crazy.
Totally. So even in this, like, seemingly simple story about a knight and his squire, Cervantes is actually saying some pretty profound things about human nature. It's amazing.
It is, and that's just one of the many reasons why Don Quixote has lasted so long. It's a story that, on the surface, might seem silly or even absurd, but underneath it all, it's about the things that make us human. Our dreams, our flaws, our hopes, our contradictions, it's all in there. But we shouldn't forget that Don Quixote isn't just about Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. There's this whole cast of characters they meet along the way.
Oh, right. All those other characters they bump into, like the innkeepers, the shepherds, the ladies in distress, they're all so memorable.
Exactly. And each encounter, even the short ones, adds something to the story, Helps us understand Don Quixote, what it's really about. Like, for example, remember that goat herd they meet who tells the story about Chrysostom?
Chrysostom. Refresh my memory.
He's this young guy who, like, dies of a broken heart because this woman, Marcella, rejects him. It's a whole mini tragedy inside the bigger story of Don Quixote.
Oh, right, right. It's like a story within a story.
Exactly. And it brings up all these themes about love and loss and the dangers of, idealizing people too much. It shows us that even in this crazy, absurd world that Don Quixote lives in, there's still room for real, genuine human emotions.
It's like Cervantes is reminding us that even though Don Quixote is this wild, fantastical venture, it's still connected to real life, to real human experiences.
You got it. And then you got characters like Cardenio, whose story is kind of like a darker, more realistic reflection of Don Quixote's own story.
So he's like a mirror image of Don Quixote, but grounded in reality.
Precisely. And that makes their meeting all the more interesting because they're both struggling with these, like, illusions, but in different ways. And through these secondary characters, these people Don Quixote meets on his journey, we get to see different sides of him, different angles on his personality. It's like each encounter adds another piece to the puzzle.
I love that. It's like you're not just reading about Don Quixote, you're getting to know him.
Exactly. And that's what makes Don Quixote such a rewarding read. It's a book that keeps giving the more you explore it.
Hmm.
But to really appreciate Don Quixote, we also need to consider its place in, like, the history of literature.
Oh, right. It's considered the first modern novel, which is huge.
Yeah.
But what does that even mean? What makes it so different from other books from that time?
Well, for one thing, Don Quixote breaks away from those traditional epic stories that were popular back then, the ones about brave knights and damsels in distress. Instead of, like, glorifying those old ideals, Cervantes kind of turns them upside down, shows how absurd they can be. And he does it through Don Quixote's misadventures.
So it's like he's taking that old genre, the knightly adventure story, and using humor to critique it, to show how unrealistic those old ideals really are.
Exactly. But he's not just making fun of those old stories. He's creating something entirely new at the same time. He's showing us these real, flawed, complicated human characters. And that's what makes Don Quixote so revolutionary. It's not just a funny story, it's a whole new way of looking at storytelling, at writing about people and the world around them.
So it's funny, but it's also pushing boundaries, changing the game.
Totally. And that's why we still read and study Don Quixote today. It's a book that changed literature forever. It paved the way for all the amazing novels that came after it.
Yep.
But before we wrap up, we should probably talk about how it all ends for Don Quixote.
Oh, yeah. The ending. Does he finally, like, snap out of it? Does he realize he's been living a fantasy this whole time?
Well, the ending is actually pretty moving. Don Quixote gives up his whole knight-errantry thing. He basically admits he's been fooling himself.
Wow. So after all those adventures, all those crazy mishaps, he just gives up.
He does. It's kind of sad, actually. But some scholars say that this ending is what makes Don Quixote more than just a funny book. It becomes about something bigger, something about, like, the human condition, about our ability to deceive ourselves,
Yeah.
but also to grow and change.
So it's like, even in admitting his mistakes, Don Quixote shows a kind of strength, a willingness to face reality even when it's painful.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that even though Don Quixote renounces his knightly life, he's not alone. Sancho Panza is right there with him, even after all the frustration, all the crazy stuff they've been through together.
It's a sweet ending, in a way. Even when Don Quixote's fantasy world falls apart, that bond between him and Sancho Panza, it stays strong. Makes you wonder if maybe Sancho Panza got something out of all this, too. Not just, frustration and a lot of bumps and bruises.
It's a good point. Maybe they both, I don't know, learned something from each other.
Yeah.
Sancho Panza, he wasn't just a sidekick, right? He had his own hopes and dreams. Maybe Don Quixote, even without meaning to, helped Sancho Panza see the world a little differently too.
Yeah.
See the possibilities, even in the midst of all the craziness.
It's funny. We've been talking about Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. Like, they're real people. Like, we actually know them. But they're just characters, right, in a book.
They are. But that's the magic of great literature, isn't it? It makes you connect with these characters, feel like you're right there with them, living their adventures. And it makes you think, right? About whether there's a little bit of Don Quixote in all of us. Maybe we don't all, attack windmills, but we all have our own ways of seeing the world, our own beliefs that might not always line up perfectly with reality, our own windmills, so to speak.
I think you're right. I know I've definitely chased a few windmills in my time. What about you? Have you ever felt like Don Quixote, like you were chasing after something that other people thought was, I don't know, foolish or impossible?
Oh, absolutely. I think we all have. And the challenge for all of us, just like for Don Quixote, is to find that balance between holding on to our ideals, our dreams, and also recognizing the limitations of our own perspectives.
It's that tightrope walk, right?
Mhm.
Too much fantasy and you lose touch with reality, but too much cynicism and you lose that sense of wonder, that belief that things can be better.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why Don Quixote has spoken to so many people for so long, why it's still relevant today. Because it's not just a story, it's like a reflection of our own lives, our own struggles to make sense of the world.
I gotta say, before we started this whole deep dive, I thought Don Quixote was just a funny book about a guy who, read too many nightly adventure stories.
Mhm.
But you've really helped me see it in a whole new way.
I'm glad to hear that. That's what we hope for with these deep dives, to spark new insights, new perspectives. And for our listeners, if you haven't already, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Don Quixote. Or if it's been a while, maybe revisit it with fresh eyes after listening to our conversation. I think you'll be surprised by how much this book, written centuries ago, still has to say about the world we live in today.
It's amazing, right? How a story can be so old and yet still feel so relevant.
It really is. Stories have this power to connect us across time and space, to remind us that, even though the world changes, people at their core are still pretty much the same. We still have the same hopes, fears, dreams, and follies. And Don Quixote, it captures all of that beautifully.
Well said. Well, I think we've covered pretty much everything, right? All the main points from the excerpts and the articles he sent in.
I think so. Yeah. We talked about Cervantes' life, his crazy adventures, his unique way of using humor. We analyzed some of the key scenes and characters, even touched on how Don Quixote influenced literature as a whole. And I think most importantly, we showed how this book, even though it was written over 400 years ago, still has something to teach us today. Still has the power to make us laugh, make us think, and maybe even make us see ourselves a little differently.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. It's been a blast exploring Don Quixote with you, and we hope you've enjoyed the journey as well.
It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, happy reading.